The descent onto Zapiraia was rough. Jack Marsden, sergeant of the 82nd Recon Unit, barely managed to steer his crash pod through the boiling clouds before the entire system shorted out and sent him plummeting toward the violet glowing jungle below. The planet hadn't been listed as hostile, but the atmosphere itself felt personal in its wrath. By the time he staggered from the shattered remains of his pod, bruised but alive, night had already fallen and the planet's twin moons had risen high above the treetops. Zapiraia was not marked as inhabited. No cities, no distress beacons, not even relics of the ancient colonies rumored to have once existed here. The briefing files had called it forsaken, a place forgotten for a reason. Jack wasn't the type to buy into superstition, but the stillness of the jungle was unnatural. Not the peace of untouched wilderness, but the quiet that follows something terrible. He activated his beacon and tried to send out a ping. No signal. Something in the ionosphere was blocking it. Typical. He sighed, checked his rifle, and began to walk. His boots crunched softly over crystalline moss, the trees arching above him like cathedral vaults, pulsing with faint bioluminescence. Then he saw movement. Not an animal, not a shadow. People. Two of them. He ducked behind a half-collapsed tree husk, heart thudding. Humanoid figures stood at the edge of a moonlit clearing, one tall and silver-haired, the other darker, cloaked in shades of midnight blue. Their skin shimmered under the dual moons, catching light in a way that looked ethereal, almost unreal. They were speaking to each other in hushed, melodic tones, and Jack knew instinctively they hadn't heard him yet. He stepped out, slowly, cautiously raising both hands. No weapon, no threat. "Hello?" he said. They turned to him as one. The moment their eyes locked onto his, the air shifted, not just emotionally, physically. The jungle hushed. A breeze curled between them, and the moons above seemed to flare brighter, casting sharp light across the clearing. The silver-haired woman took a step forward. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were ancient. Watching, measuring. She didn't speak. The dark-haired one spoke first, and her voice wasn't what he expected. It wasn't curious or welcoming. It was sharp, laced with something like awe and suspicion. "You shouldn't be here." Jack lowered his hands, his heart slowing only slightly. "I didn't exactly have a choice. Crash landing. Your planet doesn't like ships." She stepped forward. "It's not the planet, it's the moon, and it's full tonight." The silver-haired one finally spoke. Her voice was softer. "Then the choosing has begun." Jack frowned. "I don't know what that means." Neither of them explained. They only looked at each other, then at him. And Jack had the sinking feeling he'd just walked into something ancient, something sacred, and something very, very binding. They led him deeper into the jungle. Not by force, though Jack suspected they easily could have, but by some quiet, undeniable pull. The silver-haired one introduced herself as Lyra. The dark-haired one was Naira. Sisters, bonded by blood and something deeper he didn't yet understand. Their speech was elegant, precise, sometimes overlapping in a way that made him feel like he was being addressed by a single voice with two mouths. Zapiraia, they explained, was not forsaken. It was sleeping, waiting. For what? Jack asked. Naira had stopped in the path, turning her gaze to the moons. For the return of the triad. The what? Lyra stepped beside him, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dark. There must be three, when the moons are full, when blood and breath align. Then the planet awakens again. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "I think I hit my head harder than I thought." Nara tilted her head. "You jest now. But when the choosing is finished, you will not laugh. You were called here." Jack barked a laugh. "I crashed here." Lyra's voice cut through. "No one crashes on Zapiraia. No one lands here unless the planet allows it. You were brought, not by machine, by fate." Jack stopped walking. "I don't believe in fate." "Good," Naira said quietly. "That will make what's coming all the more real." They arrived at a stone formation, an ancient ring of obsidian pillars inscribed with luminous runes. The clearing around it pulsed with faint warmth, though no fire burned. Jack felt something stir beneath his feet. Not movement, but energy. A heartbeat that wasn't his. He looked from one sister to the other. "What do you want from me?" They both looked at him, their eyes so alike and yet so opposite. "It's not what we want," Lyra said. "It's what the moons demand," Naira finished. Jack backed a step. "Look, I appreciate the hospitality really, but if this is some kind of weird alien religious thing..." "It's a bond," Lyra said. It is sacred. Once made, it cannot be undone. Not by time, not by death. You must choose, Naira added, or let the moons choose for you. Jack opened his mouth, ready to argue, but the moons above flared once more, and before he could protest, a soft wind circled him, brushing against his skin like hands made of air and light, seeping into his lungs, his bones, his blood. He staggered forward, eyes wide, every instinct screaming that something profound had just begun. He looked at them again, and for the first time saw not strangers, but parts of a whole that was now inextricably tied to him. He hadn't come to Zapiraia. He had been summoned, and the choosing had already begun. The wind died slowly, as though reluctant to release him. Jack stood at the center of the ancient circle, chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, the warmth of the moonlight still pulsing against his skin. Whatever had passed through him hadn't been illusion. It felt cellular, like something had taken root inside him and whispered, "You belong to this." Lyra and Naira hadn't moved. They stood at the edge of the ring, watching him with the stillness of statues carved by purpose. Lyra, silver-haired and luminous, finally broke the silence. "The moons have accepted you." Jack frowned, voice low. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Naira said, stepping forward, "you are now bound to us. The triad has formed." He backed away from the center of the circle, weariness clawing up his spine. "I didn't agree to anything." "You didn't have to," Lyra said, almost gently. "The moons called. You answered. That is enough." "I didn't answer. I crashed," Jack snapped, gesturing to the sky. "I lost control of my ship, got burned at, and landed on this mystery rock because the nav system glitched." Naira's lips curled into something like amusement. "Glitches are often another word for fate in denial." Jack swore under his breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay, let's back up. What exactly does this bond mean? Some kind of spiritual duty? Cultural adoption? Do I have to chant? Hunt something? Sacrifice my spleen?" The sisters exchanged a glance. Then Lyra took a slow step into the circle with him. "You are now part of us," she said softly. "Not just in body, but in spirit. We are bound by a force that is older than language. Zapiraia does not request consent. It recognizes completion. You, Jack Marsden, complete the triad." Jack's mind was spiraling. In any other setting, he might have laughed it off, shaken his head, and gone back to his camp. But he had felt it. Whatever power ran through this world wasn't superstition. It had touched him, changed him. And despite every instinct to resist, he couldn't deny the pull. "So what now?" he asked, quieter. Naira stepped beside Lyra. "Now the bond must be deepened, recognized, consummated." He blinked. "Consummated?" "Yes," Lyra said. "Not merely physical. The bond requires vulnerability, honesty, trust. Zapiraia will not allow a false union. You must choose to open your heart, or the bond will fail, and we all suffer." Jack felt as though he stood on the edge of a precipice. The soldier in him hated not knowing the rules of engagement, but the man in him, the one who hadn't felt connected to anything in years. He was listening. "I don't even know you," he whispered. "But your soul does," Naira replied. And to his own surprise, Jack didn't run. He stayed. Because something in their voices made him want to believe. And because something in the wind still called him by name. They led him to a cavern beneath the jungle canopy, hidden behind a waterfall that shimmered in lunar hues. Inside, the walls glowed faintly, painted with ancient glyphs, images of other triads, other stories carved into the bones of Zapiraia itself. The air was warm, scented with minerals and moss, a sacred space. Jack stood near the entrance, unsure. Lyra moved to a stone basin and lit a ring of crystal with her fingertips. The flames that emerged weren't red or orange but pale blue and slow-moving, like water set alight. Naira knelt near the wall and whispered in a language that sounded like wind moving through tall grass. They were preparing. Jack swallowed. "Are you sure I'm the right person? What if this was all a mistake?" Lyra turned to him, her expression soft. "Do you believe in mistakes that touch the soul?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, he looked around the chamber. Everything shimmered with meaning he couldn't decode. Marks in stone, flickers in the fire, even the way their shadows danced on the walls. It felt like a place that remembered too much. A place that never forgot. Naira rose and approached him. "You are afraid." "Wouldn't you be?" "I was, the first time I saw you." Jack blinked. "You saw me before the crash?" She nodded. "In dream. The moon gave me visions. A man not from our world. Lost, broken, carrying a blade with no war left to fight. Jack stiffened. She reached for his hand. "You don't have to fight here, Jack. Only feel." And for the first time in years, he lowered his defenses. They circled him slowly, not with lust, but with reverence. Their fingers brushed his shoulders, his jaw, his heart, not seeking to conquer, but to know. Every touch asked a question. Every look offered a truth. He didn't speak, but something inside him began to respond, like a door long sealed now opening. There was no ceremony in the traditional sense, but there was fire, and breath, and words whispered against skin that meant more than vows ever could. When Jack lay beside them beneath the glow of Zapiraya's twin moons, he didn't feel owned. He felt claimed. And for the first time in his life, seen. Not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a man whose soul had found its place. And in the quiet that followed, with their heads resting on his chest and the fire burning low, Jack Marsden finally stopped asking questions. Because in that cavern, beneath a planet that chose rather than begged, he had already found every answer. The bond, once a myth wrapped in ritual, was now a living thing inside him. Jack felt it the moment he awoke. Not just a warmth or a presence, but a thread, woven through muscle and breath, connecting him to Lyra and Naira like an invisible pulse. They slept beside him in the chamber beneath the earth, the embers of the blue fire casting their bodies in soft glow. For a brief, weightless moment, Jack forgot where he was. He didn't feel like a soldier stranded on a hostile planet. He felt claimed by something vast, sacred, and terrifyingly beautiful. Lyra stirred first. Her silver hair cascaded across her shoulder as she leaned up and looked at him, calm and unreadable. "The forest knows," she said. He blinked. "Knows what?" "That the bond has taken root. It can feel your heartbeat." Jack sat up slowly, still reeling from the night before. "You're saying the planet feels us?" Naira opened her eyes now too. "It watches, it listens, and when it accepts a bond, it marks it." As if on cue, the cave trembled subtly, not with threat but with weight. The stone beneath Jack's hands warmed slightly. Outside, birds, or something like birds, sang in unfamiliar tones. Zapiraia was responding. A signal, not of alarm but recognition. The sisters led him from the chamber and back into the jungle. Dawn had turned the leaves translucent, shining with blues and purples in a light he'd never seen on any other world. Creatures peeked from branches, curious, not afraid. Plants bent slightly as they walked past, as though greeting them. "The planet, it's alive," Jack murmured. Lyra glanced over her shoulder. "Alive in ways you've never been taught to measure." They walked in silence until they reached a tall grove where trees seemed to whisper to each other. The trunks were wide and twisted, bark patterned in strange spirals that shifted when you stared too long. Vines hung like sleeping serpents, swaying in a wind that didn't exist. Jack turned to Naira. "What happens now?" She knelt at the base of the largest tree and touched her palm to its roots. "Now we are tested." "Tested how?" "If the bond is true, we will survive. If it is weak or broken, the forest will bury us." Jack stared at her, throat dry. "That's your idea of a honeymoon?" Lyra smiled faintly. "Zapiraia does not give gifts. It demands devotion." The ground beneath them vibrated. Slowly, the spiraling marks on the tree began to glow, and a low hum filled the air. The forest had begun the trial. The roots coiled outward like fingers. The air thickened with scent, honey, blood, rain. And then Jack's vision flickered. He was standing alone. The trees were gone. The sisters were gone. And in their place stood a battlefield, not one he remembered, but one that looked eerily familiar. Ash rained from the sky. Charred flags fluttered in the wind. Bodies, some alien, some human, lay broken across the ground. Jack staggered, confused. "What is this?" A voice behind him answered. "You fear what you were made to be." He turned and saw himself. Not exactly. This version wore the same armor, bore the same scars, but his eyes were empty, hollow, like someone who had killed too long and forgotten why. "You think you can find peace here?" The other Jack sneered. "You think love will save you?" "I'm not running from what I was," Jack replied. "You're lying. You want to believe you're something more, but you're still the man who followed orders when the cost was blood." The vision blurred. He saw the faces of people he'd left behind, missions that had gone wrong, screams he couldn't silence. Then another voice pierced the storm. "We see your wounds, Jack, but they are not who you are." Lyra's voice, echoing from the trees. "We accept them," Naira added. "We accept you." The ash faded. The battlefield melted away and the jungle returned. Jack fell to his knees, gasping. Lyra and Naira were beside him, each with a hand on his shoulder. The roots of the great tree had woven around them in a circle, protective, not predatory. "You passed," Naira said. "Because we passed with you," Lyra added. Jack looked up at them. "That was real, wasn't it?" "As real as anything worth surviving," Naira said. He nodded slowly, heart still pounding. "So what now?" Lyra helped him to his feet. "Now the forest knows your name, and you are no longer a stranger," said Naira. The vines released them. The whispering stopped. But in Jack's chest, something had settled. Not fear, not confusion, but belonging. For the first time in his life, he belonged not to a war, not to an army, but to something sacred, something chosen. And it had chosen him back. By the time they returned to the edge of the jungle, the moons had risen once more. The clearing where Jack first met Lyra and Naira now felt different. Not merely a patch of wilderness, but a place where destinies had collided and made something alive. The bond wasn't just symbolic anymore. Jack could feel the women when they were close, when they looked at him, when they breathed. Their presence pulsed in him like a second heartbeat. The sisters said little as they led him back to the high cliffs overlooking the ancient craters to the east. There, seated above the clouds, they sat together, sharing a silent meal of fruits and steamed root flesh warmed by stone. Jack had questions, an entire ocean of questions, but something in the air told him to wait. Zapiraia never rushed anything. It taught through patience, pressure, presence. Eventually Naira broke the quiet. "Do you hear it?" Jack tilted his head, chewing. "What?" "The planet breathing." He listened. At first he heard nothing but the wind and the distant creak of trees, but then it came. Low, rhythmic, like a drumbeat beneath the soil, steady and slow. The kind of sound that didn't reach the ears, but the bones. A resonance, not a noise. "That's real?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from trembling. Lyra nodded. "It speaks through the stone, the water, and the root. It knows we are bound." Jack looked out over the valley. "What does it want?" Naira looked at him, her gaze more solemn than ever. Protection. Before he could ask from what, the clouds rippled unnaturally, and a sudden flash of light split the sky. Jack jumped to his feet. The sisters were already standing, eyes fixed on the heavens. "Ships," Lyra murmured. They found the signal. Zapiraia, once considered forsaken, had been pinging in a far-off frequency since Jack's arrival. Unbeknownst to him, his crash had triggered old surveillance beacons buried deep within the planet's crust. Beacons left behind by explorers who had come centuries ago and never returned. Jack stepped forward. "Those aren't your people, are they?" Naira shook her head. "No, they're yours." A wave of nausea hit him. If the Earth fleet was inbound, they wouldn't come quietly. The command would send a reconnaissance team first, maybe two. If they sensed anything unusual or hostile, they'd send a cleaner unit. Zapiraia wouldn't stand a chance. Not with its gentle wildness, its sacred quiet. They'd dissect it, digitize it, destroy it. Jack turned to the sisters. "We have to warn the forest. The forest already knows," Lyra said. From below, the ground trembled, not the way it had during the bonding. This was different. Urgent. The jungle reacted first. Trees leaned into each other. The roots shifted. Leaves curled upward toward the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a sound like groaning metal echoed through the valley, but there were no machines in sight. "What do we do?" he asked, voice tight. "You speak to them," Naira said. "You're of their kind. You must convince them to leave. They won't listen to one man." Lyra placed a hand over his chest. "You are not one man anymore." And he knew what she meant. He was earthborn, forged in war, raised in the grid of command. But Zapiraia had made something new in him. The bond between them wasn't myth, it was fact. And now he had to use it. The Earth fleet arrived in the morning. 2 reconnaissance vessels, sleek and silver, casting shadows like knives across the cliffs. Their engines purred low and threatening as they landed, stirring the jungle into hushed silence. Jack stood on the plateau with Lyra and Naira behind him, arms crossed, armor dusty and scuffed, but still intact. His comm link flared to life. A voice buzzed in his ear. "Sergeant Marsden, this is Commander Breck of the UES Harrowing. You've been MIA for 6 days. You are ordered to return to the extraction vessel immediately." Jack pressed the button on his chest plate, voice steady. "Negative, Commander. I'm remaining on Zapiraia." There was a pause. "Sergeant, are you injured?" "No, sir." But I've found something here. Something alive, a culture, a bond. A bond? They're not primitive, Commander. They're powerful. This planet is conscious, it's awake, and if you try to force it into submission, you're compromised. The voice snapped. Prepare for detainment. Jack looked up at the vessels overhead. One of the doors began to lower. Soldiers emerged, rifles at the ready, moving in coordinated formation. The jungle recoiled, and the soil beneath their boots quivered. They're going to fire, Naira said softly. They'll try, Jack muttered. The first soldier raised his weapon, and the ground responded. Massive root systems burst from the soil, encircling the landing gear and yanking the front vessel downward. Screams erupted from the intercoms. The jungle wasn't just reacting, it was defending. Zapiraia is rejecting them, Lyra whispered. She sees them as invaders. Jack stepped forward, arms raised. Stop! Hold your fire! But the commander didn't listen. The second ship launched a flare, bright and sharp, and Jack saw the jungle flinch, the way an animal flinches from pain. He turned to the sisters. Can you stop it? No, Lyra said. Only you can. Jack took a breath and ran. He sprinted past the tangled roots between the startled soldiers and climbed onto the hull of the lead vessel. His comm still buzzed with orders, but he ignored them. He knelt and pressed his palm to the metal. Zapiraia, he whispered. Listen to me. These aren't enemies, they're blind. I'll make them see. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the roots stilled, the ground sighed, and the soldiers lowered their rifles. Commander Breck's voice returned, this time quieter. Sergeant? What are you? Jack turned toward the jungle where Lyra and Naira stood tall among the vines and rising mist. I'm the bridge, he said. He looked up into the clouds where Earth hovered, and down to the soil where Zapiraia pulsed. And he knew. He had been made in one world, but he was chosen by another, and he would belong to both. The soldiers didn't speak much after the roots withdrew. They stood in loose formation at the edge of the jungle, hands near triggers, eyes wary not of the man who once stood among them, but of the forest that moved when he whispered. Jack had never seen that look on their faces before. Those hardened Marines, trained to stare down orbital flame barrages without flinching, now watched the vines as if they were alive. Because they were. Commander Breck remained in the gunship, barking orders through the comm system that no one really obeyed. Jack hadn't gone back. He stood between the line of soldiers and the trees, arms crossed, posture unreadable. Behind him stood Lyra and Naira, neither armed, neither armored, yet infinitely more powerful than anyone else on the plateau. The sisters didn't look afraid. They watched the humans like observers from another time, another truth. I'm not leaving, Jack said again. The commander's voice crackled, laced with disbelief. You've gone native. No, I've gone aware. Silence. Then, from the jungle behind him, a low hum began to rise. Not mechanical, not electronic, but something else. A resonance. Lyra stepped forward, her silver hair lifting faintly in the rising breeze. Naira followed, her dark eyes glowing with soft moonlight, though the moons weren't out. They walked beside Jack and placed a hand each on his shoulders. The resonance grew. What the hell is this? One soldier murmured, his rifle twitching. Jack didn't look back. This is what happens when you talk instead of conquer. The hum grew into vibration. The forest shimmered with light that had no source. Not fire, not energy, just presence. The planet was responding. Not with violence, with declaration. The bond that had been forged in secret, deep beneath root and rock, now echoed through every living thing. The soldiers slowly lowered their weapons. Jack turned toward them. Zapiraia isn't yours to claim. She doesn't want your scanners, your samples, or your weapons. She wants guardians, not thieves. And you're her chosen protector now? Breck asked. There was no more sarcasm in his voice, only resignation. No, I'm her guest, her bond, her voice. And I'm telling you, if you want to make it off this world in one piece, you'll walk backward and say thank you. The wind gusted, strong and sudden, lifting dust and leaves into a spiral. None of the soldiers moved, until one did. A young corporal stepped forward, looked at Jack for a long time, and then lowered his eyes and nodded. Without a word, he turned and began the slow walk back to the ship. The others followed. Commander Breck didn't argue again. As the ships lifted off hours later, leaving behind only blast marks and awkward silence, Jack stood with Lyra and Naira beneath the ancient trees. He didn't watch the ships disappear. He looked at the forest. And for the first time, The forest looked back. Days passed. Zapiraia healed quickly. The landing zone was overgrown by the third night. The marks left by the humans were swallowed by moss and time. The jungle didn't hold grudges. It simply erased what it didn't need. Jack adjusted faster than he expected. The bond with Lyra and Naira had deepened since the trial. He could feel their emotions like weather fronts brushing across his chest. Their joy was a warm wind. Their anger a brief static on his skin. At first, it unsettled him. Then, he found peace in it. Because he was never alone anymore. Even in silence, they were with him. They spent their nights in the cave beneath the roots. Lyra's hands often traced the carvings in the walls, humming to herself in a language that only trees remembered. Naira taught Jack to listen to the ground, how to press his ear to the stone and hear where the water moved, where the roots grew restless. They didn't speak of love, not directly. Zapiraia language had no word for it. Instead, they showed it in presence, in touch, in breath, shared without expectation. One night, under the returning full moons, the sisters woke him before dawn and led him beyond the forest's edge, across the barren valley, up the cliffs of red stone, to a place where the stars sat closer and the wind never rested. They stood before a stone platform chiseled with the symbols of old triads. It was a sacred site, older than memory. "What is this?" Jack asked, his breath steaming in the cool air. "The offering," Lyra said. "It marks the end of the trial and the beginning of permanence." Naira stepped forward, a small obsidian bowl in her hands. Inside it, a thick blue paste shimmered with bioluminescent threads. "This is the mark of union," she said. "If you accept it, it binds you not only to us, but to the planet, forever." Jack looked between them. "And if I don't?" Lyra's voice was quiet. "You will be free to leave. No anger, no shame, but the bond will fade, the memories will remain, the love will be undone." He stared at the bowl, at the sky, at them. His past flashed across his mind. Every war, every failure, every brother he'd buried, every order he'd followed. He had never belonged anywhere. Until now. He reached into the bowl and pressed his fingers into the paste. It was warm, alive. He smeared it across his chest. A slow rumble built in the earth. The carvings around the altar began to glow, and the wind sang. Lyra and Naira stepped forward and did the same. They pressed their marks to his, and the three of them stood together as light spiraled from the stone into the stars. The planet accepted him, not as a soldier, not as a visitor, but as part of its soul. And in that moment, Jack Marsden ceased to be a man of Earth. He became Zaphirian. He became home. The seasons shifted on Zapiraia, though not like Earth's harsh turns. Here, changes moved like breath, subtle, slow, and almost imperceptible unless you were deeply rooted. Jack began to notice them. The leaves deepened in color. The light took on a richer hue. The scent of the wind changed. He'd once measured time in rotations and patrol shifts. Now he measured it by how the trees whispered at dusk or how Naira's footsteps grew lighter in the morning dew. The people who had once seen him as an intruder had faded into memory. The Earth fleet had not returned. Perhaps because of his warning. Perhaps because Zapiraia had swallowed their signal and erased them from its radar entirely. Either way, the silence that followed was not ominous. It was peaceful. Yet peace never came without work. Zapiraia had accepted him. But that did not mean the planet was without danger. There were things in the deep wood, things that moved differently, shadows that never rose into moonlight, creatures older than even the sisters remembered. Jack was warned never to go too far beyond the circle of watchers, where the trees were wider than shuttles and their roots rose like ancient towers. Even Zapiraia had teeth. Still, Jack trained, not to fight, not in the way he used to, but to protect, to preserve. He reforged his armor using materials from the jungle, now bound not with steel but hardened resin and woven veincloth. He taught Lyra and Naira earth tactics and learned their own, stealth techniques that turned their footfalls into wind, evasion methods rooted in rhythm with the planet's pulse. Together, they became not a pair, not even a triad, but a force of their own kind. One afternoon, while walking the riverbanks, they came upon a pod, not one of Earth's, but old, ancient, half buried in the muck and roots, rusted over and almost consumed by the jungle. The markings were from another language, neither Zaphirian nor human. Naira touched the hull and recoiled, her fingers trembling. "This is where it began," she whispered. "What?" Jack asked. This was the first arrival, the ones who claimed this planet centuries ago and disappeared. We believed they vanished, but they didn't. Lyra pressed her palm to the hatch, and the metal responded with a soft hum. They were taken by the forest, she said, or perhaps they chose to become part of it. Jack crouched beside them, or they couldn't survive the bond. Silence followed. The pod didn't open. They left it there, undisturbed, as a reminder that not everyone who landed here could become something new. But Jack had. And with that truth in his chest, he held their hands and walked home beneath the golden canopy of dusk. The next full moon rose slowly, bathing Zapiraia in silver fire. The sky was cloudless. The stars held their breath. It had been one full cycle since Jack's crash. The night of his arrival, everything had changed. He had changed. And now, on the anniversary of that moment, the bond demanded completion, not of flesh, but of name. At the edge of the cliff where stone met sky, Lyra and Naira stood wrapped in ceremonial cloth spun from moon thread. They bore no weapons. They wore no armor, only markings painted across their shoulders, symbols of the union they now shared. Jack stepped forward in silence, his body wrapped in the same cloth, his chest marked with the same blue pigment that had once sealed the bond. No words were exchanged. The ritual was not spoken. It was lived. The sisters began to chant in perfect unison, their voices low and resonant. The planet responded, winds circling the cliff, fireflies rising in spirals, trees bowing in subtle reverence. Jack knelt. He placed his hand on the soil and whispered the final vow, not for Earth, not for any watching god, but for them. I am no longer what I was. I am of Zapiraia, of root, of moon, of bond. I am yours. Naira stepped forward and kissed his forehead. Lyra followed and kissed his heart. They embraced as the moons crossed paths in the sky, their glow merging into one bright light that lit the world in a brilliance few eyes would ever see. And in that moment, Zapiraia was whole. They returned to the forest, not as strangers or lovers or symbols, but as one. 3 bodies, 1 pulse, bond eternal,